Let's take a look at the channels panel without being able to see the colors. So I have a screenshot of the Ferris wheel image that I've been using for this slideshow. And you can see that if I just look at the channels panel at the very top, it will tell me that the image on the left is comprised of red, green, and blue, and the image on the right is comprised of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And that might seem confusing because they look the same or similar. Keep in mind that you can create a full color image, the representation of the colors that you would see in the real world, by using a process blend of different colors. And on the screen, I can choose red, green, and blue to create that full color illusion. Or if I print it, I can use CMYK. But if I'm preparing an image for print, I still have to look at it on the screen. So when I change a color mode to CMYK, even though in theory, I'm not looking at the image in CMYK, I'm looking at it in RGB because I'm looking at a computer screen, I'm still preparing it for the printed output. So not until you look further down on the channels panel will you be able to see how those colors are distributed. And so you can see in the RGB image, because there's 3 channels opposed to the 4 channels of CMYK, that each channel has more color in it. It's a little bit more dense than the others. And in CMYK, those colors are distributed in 4 ways instead of 3, and you can see that black is just kind of a pop of color on the top of all the other colors. But there's mostly cyan in the image because the background is the ocean and the sky. Before I forget, I would like to remind everyone, I'm sure you've read it in your textbook already, it is a good idea to do all of your editing in RGB color mode until you get to the point where you're starting to prepare your artwork for final output. And then you should start to change your settings based on your output specifications in regard to color. The reason that I recommend this, and that your book and that most people recommend this, is twofold. First, when images are captured digitally, they are captured with a light sensor that captures your image in RGB. And so if you want to edit in CMYK, you immediately have to take an RGB image and you have to convert it to CMYK, which is destructive editing. You can't go back and say, oh, it was CMYK, now I want to change it back and be RGB, because if you do that, you're not going to get the same RGB that you had. So you're going to take RGB, convert it to CMYK, lose some data, and then take CMYK and go, oh, I really should have left it RGB. If you change it back to RGB, you're going to have some sort of RGB representation of the CMYK image. And then secondly, Photoshop works better in RGB. Almost every single option that you would have for editing is available in RGB color mode, and you'll notice that if you change your color mode to anything besides RGB, so like CMYK, there's also grayscale, you can make a duotone and different things like that, you'll notice that some of the features disappear. Some filters won't work. There are adjustments that you can make that just will gray out and you won't have that option. And so I would highly recommend that you do all of your editing in RGB color mode, and then when it's time to output, then you can start to talk about what you would need to do to convert the color to your output device's color profile. Document color modes are directly related to the number of channels that an image will have. And so we've talked about 2 different color modes that you could have for your project, RGB and CMYK. There are different channels that you could have. If you choose lab color, which is a different color mode, you'll notice that instead of having colored channels, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, you have lightness, A and B, and those are just another way to represent the color. We'll talk more about them in future slides. So keep that in mind. RGB and lab will default to have 3 channels of color, and CMYK will default to have 4. So in general, a CMYK image would have a larger file size than a lab or an RGB file because it has 4 channels of data that your file has to remember as opposed to 3. There are other color modes that you can choose that will have 1 channel by default, and they are bitmap, duotone, and grayscale. When you choose these and then you look at the channels panel, you'll notice that all the colors are in 1 channel. That's because with bitmap and grayscale, it's kind of obvious. It just has the 1 color, just shades of black, and the duotone only gets the 1 channel as well. Before we move forward, I want to jump back to Photoshop and I want to show you how to change your color modes. And so sometimes you'll have to change your color mode for a reason. I'm going to leave this channels panel open so you can see what happens to it. To change your color mode, you need to go to the image menu and mode, and then choose the color mode that you want. You'll notice that I can't choose bitmap or duotone, that because it requires me to change the image to grayscale first, and then I'll be able to choose those options. So let's change the color mode from RGB to CMYK. And depending on the colors in the image, you could see a huge shift in the way the colors look, because RGB can produce certain colors and CMYK can produce certain colors, and not all colors can be reproduced in both color modes. Bright greens, if you have an image that's bright green, are notorious for this. Instead of looking bright green, when you change the image to CMYK, you'll notice that you dull the color. And that's the reason that when I choose CMYK, I'll get a prompt on the screen that says you're about to convert to a CMYK image using, and then you can read the rest of the dialogue. But basically what it's saying is you're going to destroy your channels. You're going to rip them apart, you're going to repurpose them, and you're going to make them CMYK. Are you sure you want to do this? Because there's no going back unless you immediately hit undo. So if I hit OK, you'll notice that the image didn't change too much. The greens look a little more dull in the background. And then if I look over here on the channels panel, I'll notice that now I have 4 channels of color instead of 3. Now if I was to go back to image mode and then RGB, in theory I would say, oh, I'm going to make it brighter again because, I made it duller by making it CMYK, but now I'll make it RGB. But you've lost the brightness data, and so when I convert it from CMYK back to RGB, it still has the more flat, duller tones to it that a CMYK image would reproduce. If you want to change the color mode to grayscale, you can do that by choosing image mode and then grayscale. I would caution you, if you're a photographer, converting your image to grayscale will discard all of your channels and kind of give you a flat image. There are many better ways to desaturate an image than to make it grayscale, because grayscale has 1 channel of color. If you left it as an RGB image or a CMYK image and you desaturated the image, you would still have 3 or 4 channels of color, which create more depth to your image. But sometimes you need to make it grayscale. In addition, if it's grayscale, you can then make it bitmap, and I'm going to undo this one pretty quickly because it's not going to look so great. You can zoom in. You'll see that the image has been broken down, and if you look at it closely, it is just black and white. There's no gray whatsoever. It's creating the illusion of gray as I zoom out. I'm going to undo that. And then the last one that you might want to play around with is duotone, and what's important about a duotone is that it's actually a 3-step process. First, you have to convert the image to grayscale. Then you can convert the image to duotone. But if you just hit OK and you leave it, you're still looking at a grayscale image. A duotone is 2 tones. And so if I go back to image mode and duotone, in that dialog box, you'll see that I can actually make a duotone, a tritone, or a quad tone. And the way to do that is to add a second color. And white is not your second color. Black and white is a grayscale image. But if I click on this guy here, I can choose the second color of the image, and I could make a black and a red image. Or I could make a tritone image, and I could choose yellow. And I could make an image out of 3 colors. I'm going to make this back to a duotone. I don't have to use black and white. If you wanted to use red and yellow, you could. Not sure how that would look. But now you have a red and you have a yellow image. Make sure that if you're creating a duotone, specifically for Project 1 in this class, that you have 2 colors to your image so that you get full credit for that activity.